Long ago, there existed a princess in the far distant ends of Russia. And this princess, she was beautiful, as all princesses are, at least in their own imagination, if not always in the flesh. But she was beautiful in the flesh. She had all the correct proportions, long limbs, elegance, beautiful hair, stunning eyes. But she lacked sparkle. She lacked spark. For this princess, due to various horrendous circumstances, too sad to tell, had never once in her life, even as a baby, even as a small child, never once had she laughed, never once had she smiled. And you can have a face that is, in every guise, perfect, a sculpture's paragon of beauty. But if you haven't got that twinkle, that sparkle, that life, that capacity to engage, then, well, you may as well be a block of marble in a sculptor's workshop. And her father knew this, her mother knew this, her brothers and her sisters knew this, and they despaired of ever bringing that sparkle into her, giving her that verve, that passion, that life. They had hired the best jesters in the land who had told her every kind of joke they could think of. They'd juggled, they'd tumbled, they'd leapt, they'd rolled around the floor as acrobats. They'd done everything they could think of to try and make her laugh, and nothing. Not a twitch, not a giggle, not a guffaw, not even a titter, nothing. She was titterless, it has to be said, as I'm sure the ghost of Frankie Howard would say. And so the king had announced across the kingdoms, or I should say Tsar really, shouldn't I, being it's Russia? The Tsar had announced across the kingdoms that if anyone, any man could come forward who was not already wed to somebody else, that is, and make his daughter laugh, well, he would give her hand in marriage to the man who could bring life, bring warmth, bring joy, bring joie de vivre to his poor, cold, distant, icy daughter's life. And many tried. Rich men, poor men, tall men, short men, fat men, thin men, handsome men, ugly men. Every shade and size and permutation of man had given a good crack at making her laugh. She had heard probably every joke that had ever been composed by wit. She heard dirty songs. She saw all manner of strange displays, and nothing. Just a stone. And the king and the queen despaired, the Tsar and the Tsarina. They despaired of ever seeing their daughter show any signs of well, just basic humanity. And whilst they were sitting in their palace, scratching their heads and tearing their hair out and wondering what on earth could be done, far off, many a mile away, in a small, humble abode, there lived 3 brothers. The eldest, the middle, and the youngest. And their father was a woodsman, and he had equipped his boys with axes. He wasn't a rich woodsman, and it's taken him a long time to save up the 3 axes, but eventually he'd managed by scrimping and saving. And he hoped that his sons would start out in the woodsman trade and would have great luck and great fortune, and perhaps some of them might either grow up to become the richest woodsman in those their parts, or maybe they would find other trades, and whatever money they raised as woodsmen they would be able to invest in other avenues. And he sent his eldest son out and equipped him with a fine cake that the woodsman's wife, the boy's mother, had made, and a bottle of wine, for they were old enough to be drinking alcohol by this point, with his axe over his shoulder, and said to his son, "Go out and chop down a great tree and hack the wood into sizable logs like I've shown you to do, and pile up the wagon and bring it back, and we'll take the wood to market and make a fortune." And off the lad went, deep into the woods, and there he passed a frail and tiny little old man, so tiny he was barely within the range of human height, with long white hair and a great long nose which was pink at the end, heavily wrinkled like an old weathered apple that had been left too long in the barn. And the old man said, "Will you share with me some of your cake and some of your wine, for I have not eaten or drunk in an awfully long time?" And the young man said, "No, get your own. What do I look like, a charity?" And off he went into the woods. And the old man sat there, heavy of heart, listening to the chop, chop, chop of the young man as he hacked away at whatever tree he had chanced upon to chop down. Well, it was some considerable time before the eldest son came back, and the father and the mother grew a little worried about him, and they said to their middle son, "Well, you go out into the woods and see if you can spot your elder brother, and while you're there, take your axe, and here's a cake, and here's a bottle of wine, and off you go, chop down some wood, and find out what's happened to your brother." And he went off following much the same path into the woods that his elder brother had. And there he again came across the old man, who made the same request for a little bit of cake and a little bit of wine, and received much the same answer, that did the middle son look like a charity, and frankly the old man could go off and do one. And the middle son wandered off into the woods, and whether or not he found his elder brother I can't honestly tell you, but the old man heard the distant chop, chop, chop as the middle son hacked at a tree, and it was quite some considerable time before the middle son came home, let alone the eldest son. And the father and the mother grew a little worried about their two elder sons, and they turned to look at their youngest son, who probably did have a name, but they'd taken to calling him Simpleton. For he was not the brightest button in the shop. He was naive, he was, one might say, innocent and trusting if we're trying to be flattering, or gullible and a little bit thick if we're trying not to be flattering. He was often suckered in, he was often bullied and abused by his two older brothers, by his father, by his mother, by the other children, not that he was a child anymore in the village, and by the other young men, now that he was a young man in the village. And they wondered what would become of him. They had great dreams for their eldest and for their middle, who had reasonable amount of brains and courage and bravery and daring and certainly forceful personalities. But the youngest just seemed to drift around, a rather silly and naive thing. But, still awaiting the return of their eldest and their middle, they said to the youngest, "Well, take your axe, go in the woods, see if you can find your two older brothers, and whilst you're at it, cut down a tree, bring back some wood. You don't need to bring back too much, just enough for the fires in the oven here, but bring some back." And the youngest said, "You have something to eat and something to drink?" And they looked around. The good cake had gone, and they looked around. And there was a bit of an old biscuit that had been left a little bit too long in the oven, had gone really rather brittle and burnt. There was no wine, that had all drunk. That had all been good wine had been given to the two eldest ones, and there's some dregs of old beer in a bottle. I thought, "Oh, well, you have the old beer and you have this biscuit, and that'll have to do you." And off he wandered, following much the same path as his elder brother and his middle brother. And he came upon the old man, who made the same request. And the youngest son said, "Of course, you can have a bit my biscuit, a bit my beer. We sit down, we share it, and then I go and get some word. See if I find my brothers." And he opened the little folded up handkerchief that the biscuit had been placed in. And the old man looked at it and said, "That is not a biscuit. That is a very fine-looking cake." And when Simpleton looked at it, he saw it was no longer the burnt-up old biscuit that his mother had wrapped up in a handkerchief. It was now a most impressive-looking cake, and much more impressive than the slabs of cake that had been given to his two brothers. And when he reached into his satchel to bring out the dregs of beer, the old man looked at it and said, "That is not dregs of beer. That is quite the finest vintage wine that I have seen in a very long time." And when Simpleton looked at it, the bottle of beer with a few old dregs slopping round in the bottom had indeed turned into a bottle of very fine wine with a label so fancy Simpleton couldn't read it. And they sat, and between them they ate their fill of cake, and they drank their fill of very good wine. And then Simpleton said, "Well, it would be nice sitting talking to you, but I got to go and cut down the cake." I don't know why Russian would have an accent like that, but never mind. "Well, you got to go and cut down the cake. You got to go and cut down a tree, not cake. I just eating the cake. You got to go and cut down a tree." And the old man said, well, I will come with you and help. And they wandered into the woods a bit, and Simpleton saw a tree and said, you think I cut down that one? And the old man said, no, I think you would be much better off cutting down that tree over there. And Simpleton, not one to put up arguments, said, all right, then I go and do as you say. I cut down that one. And he chopped down the tree. It only took him 5 strokes of his axe to do it, even though that axe was a rather cheap axe. Not the best of axes, and certainly quite blunt most of the time, but it cut through that tree like butter. And as the tree came down, Simpleton and the old man who was at his shoulders saw, sitting in the hollow of the tree as it fell, a goose with the most beautiful golden feathers that glittered almost as if they actually were gold, and not merely the colour of gold. And the goose squawked at them, and Simpleton took a few steps back, and the old man said, hey, you really should pick up that goose, and take it with you. It may be a very valuable addition to your life. And Simpleton tucked his foot and said, right you are, mister, I go and get the goose. And picked it up. And the goose, well, if geese could be said to purr or make noises of contentment, that is what that golden goose did. It made noises of contentment as Simpleton tucked it under his arm. And the old man directed him in chopping up the wood with his other hand, and loading it into his satchel, and they wandered back without any sight or sound of the 2 older brothers at this stage. And the old man said, I have a little coin in my bag. Perhaps we could stop at an inn and get something to eat, and I will treat you. You having been so kind and so generous to me with your provisions, I shall treat you with some provisions as well. And not one to pass up the offer of free beer and a free meal. Simpleton agreed. They stopped at an inn, parked themselves on a bench. They ordered some beer, they ordered some food. The barmaid who was bringing the food out said, oh my dear, that's a lovely goose you got there. I've never seen a goose the colour of that before. And she reached out and stroked the goose's feathers, and the goose made strange noises of contentment. And when the barmaid went to pull her hand away from the feathers of the goose, so soft and warm were they, she found she couldn't quite get her hand off the goose. She said, what on earth is this? Is this witchcraft? Is this magic? What's going on here? And Simpleton said, you don't know. It's just a goose, not a magic goose, it's just a goose. The woman tried to pull, she got more and more irate as she was trying to pull and tuck her hand away and getting panicked. Had this half-witted lad covered the goose in glue or tar or something for some bizarre joke? Was her hand to be stuck to this wretched bird for hours, days? What was to happen? She said at length, put down that goose that I might pull my hand away more effectively. Poor old Simpleton tried to put down the goose, but the goose was as much glued to his oxter as it was to the barmaid's hand. And all of the noise and the flapping and the squawking and the agitation attracted the attention of the innkeeper, who was the barmaid's uncle. And he came over and said, what on earth is going on here? And they explained to him, or at least his niece did, in very voluble terms, and seeing that it was not the joke he initially thought it was, and that she really was getting quite distressed and her hand really didn't seem to come away from the goose at all, he took a firm grip on his niece's waist, and he gave a heave. And they pulled and they tugged, and he was a big man, he was a big bear of a man. They pulled and they tugged and they tugged and they pulled, but nothing on earth would pull the young woman's hand away from the goose. And when the innkeeper went to let go of his niece's waist in order to go and fetch help from elsewhere, he found his hands was glued to her waist as her hand was glued to the goose. And then customers in the bar started to get involved, and they took a hold of the innkeeper and they pulled at him. And of course, when that didn't work, they realised that they could no more get their hands off the innkeeper than the innkeeper could get his hands off his niece, or the niece could get her hands off the goose. And after a good hour's worth of heaving and struggling and carrying on, there was a line of 8 people and a goose, all glued to each other, and the goose in its turn glued right at the front to poor old Simpleton. And they were huffing and puffing and shouting and swearing and ranting and raging at each other. And poor old Simpleton turned to his elderly friend that he'd met in the woods and said, What are you meant to do? And the old man said, I think we should go and consult with maybe the village doctor. They wandered out of the inn and through the town, attracting the attention of all and sundry. A lot of people would stop and they'd grab hold of it, give a heave and a heave. And of course exactly the same would happen to them. They'd end up glued to the person in front of them. And by the time they arrived at the doctor's house, there were now 12 people and a goose and Simpleton, all glued to each other. And the doctor came out puffing his pipe and looking very, very important, as indeed he was, as a very educated and learned man. And he looked at all the various people, and he looked at the goose, and he poked and prodded at them with his pipe, and he took out his stethoscope and put it on various parts of different people's anatomy, having first warmed it, and had not a clue what on earth to say to any of them, because what was happening? He had no more idea what was happening than anybody else did. But knowing that he could charge quite a nice sum of money to get each one of these people free, he went and put on his gloves, the ones he used for examinations, and said, Right, I shall have a go at loosening you up. And he went to the back, and after a bit of a more listen with his stethoscope and a bit of a poke and a prod with a thermometer here and there, he took a firm grip on the rather buxom lady that was right at the very back of this long, long line, and he heaved and he struggled and he struggled and he heaved and achieved absolutely nothing, except irritating the rather buxom lady. And when he attempted to remove his hands, he, of course, was as glued as anyone else. And he went, I have gloves, but that made not a blind bit of difference. So as much as he tried to pull his hand out of the glove and leave the gloves attached to the buxom lady, he could no more get his hands out of the gloves than he could get the gloves off the lady. And again, Simpleton at the front said to his elder friend, I don't know what to do now. The doctor's not been able to do nothing. What do I do? And the old man said, maybe we should go and talk to the priest at the church. Maybe he can do something. And off they went to the church. And the priest came out with a great long beard and rather rheumy eyes that were used to peering at people in a suspicious fashion to see what sins they had been up to this week. And he looked at the length of the queue and said, clearly you are cursed by God for your sinfulness, greed, no doubt, in grabbing the goose of the golden feathers, and drunkenness at the inn. And no doubt, and here he looked up and down at the doctor with his hands clamped upon the rather buxom lady. Lust! No doubt, lust has led some of you astray. You must pray. And they prayed. Every single one of them, they prayed passionately, having traipsed from the inn to the doctor's house, and from the doctor's house to the church. Their feet were beginning to get sore. And having made sure everyone prayed, he went up and down the queue, asperging them with holy water, and he waved his thurible about and gave them a good censing with the incense. And at length he said, I command you, power of sinfulness, to be gone. And nothing happened. So I must lay hands, holy hands, upon your... And he placed his hands upon the doctor's shoulders, and he heaved, and he tugged, and he tugged, and he heaved, and recited every psalm he could think of to recite whilst he was doing it, and nothing happened, except that he became glued to the queue. And with a lot more highly unpriestly language, they began to traipse on, for the old man had said, I wonder, if perhaps we need to consult with a higher authority. Here in the town, just 5 miles over, the bishop is on a visit." And the priest was able to confirm that this was indeed the case. And they'd rather hope the bishop would come to his church, but unlikely. And so this rather ill-tempered and bedraggled line of people had to trudge 5 miles. And it began to rain, drizzle, thankfully, just lightly, but rain nonetheless, halfway on their journey. And by the time they arrived at the very impressive church in the town 5 miles over, they were soaked, and they were bedraggled, and they were splattered with mud from the roadway, and they were in a foul temper, every single one of them. And they'd, of course, met a few idiots on the road who'd have a go at pulling and tugging, and so the queue was now 25 people, and a goose, and a simpleton. And they arrived at this grand, impressive, wealthy church in this grand, impressive, wealthy town. And there was the grand and impressive and wealthy bishop on a visit to the priest of that particular church. And the elderly priest from the humble church in the village called out in distress to the bishop, "My lord! My lord, your grace, will you not help?" And so the crowd explained in rather garbled terms what had happened to them, and how they'd tried the doctor and his remedies, and how they'd tried the priest and his prayers. And the bishop looked them up and down and said, "It seems to me that a full Bible reading is called for." And he summoned his junior priests, who began to read different sections of the Bible out loud over the crowd. And the bishop walked up and down, and he intoned various prayers in Latin. And everyone oohed and ahed to be very impressed by the intonation of prayers in Latin. And at the end of it he said, "I command you, spirits of evil, leave these people, these wicked sinners, leave them. Go back to the infernal regions." And nothing happened. Well, the bishop became quite irate by this point, and having done his most theatrical exorcisms and had his assistant priests and assorted choir boys singing hymns and reciting sections of the Bible and waving thuribles and splashing holy water by the bucket load all over the place, he decided to roll up his sleeves, and he had sorted them out. So he took a firm grip of the person right at the very back of the queue, and heaved and he tugged and he tugged and heaved and put a foot on their back and gave a great big tug, and absolutely nothing happened except for the fact that now his hands and his foot were attached to the chap right at the very back. And the procession continued on, the bishop hopping and hopping mad, other people staggering and wilting with exhaustion from the long 5 mile plus trudge, because they'd gone all around the village before doing their 5 mile trudge into the town. Wet, bedraggled, miserable, ill-tempered, effing and blinding as they went, even the bishop letting vent to some very colourful Latin as he hopped along at the back, and he called for one of his junior priests to take a grip behind him, knowing the man would be glued at him, but believing this would give him a bit more stability as he hopped along, to have somebody else at the back to steady him. So the queue, by the time it arrived at the advice of the old man from the woods, who said, "Well, the bishop cannot advise, cannot help. Maybe we need to turn to a more worldly authority and go and see the Tsar. I mean, it's only another 5 miles to the city gates. We can consult with the Tsar and something can be done." So, after another 5 mile trudge through the drizzle and the increasing mud of the roads, and yet more fools joining the queue on the journey as they passed travellers of all manner of ages and sexes and sizes, and social stations. There were men and there were women, there were young and there were old and there were children, there were soldiers, there were priests, there were farmers, there were merchants, there were monks, there were craftsmen and tradesmen, oh, you name it, there were it. On this great long line that finally arrived at the gates of the great city, there was now 57 of them, and a goose and Simpleton. And, well, the soldiers at the gates had no idea what on earth to make of this, and they, of course, got all very huffy and puffy, as soldiers will, when they feel that their dignity is being imposed upon, and they had a go at separating people, and, of course, they became glued to them as well. So now, by the time they arrived at the doors of the Tsar's palace, there were 64 of them glued to one another, and the goose and Simpleton. And into the palace they went, weeping and wailing and cursing and sobbing and ranting and staggering and stumbling and hopping in the case of the bishop. In they were shown by the bewildered servants who were scared half to death by what they were seeing, and by the time they arrived into the great chamber where the Tsar and the Tsarina sat upon their thrones, there was this great tumble of people and a few of the palace servants glued right at the very back. Ranting and raving and calling and crying and pleading and begging and stumbling and stepping. And the princess, the one with a face like a hatchet, who had never once smiled, never once giggled, never once chortled, never once guffawed, not so much as even sniggered in her life, looked at the hopping bishop, looked at the bedraggled fishwives effing and blinding, looked at the exhausted priests covered in mud from the road, looked at the pompous merchants in ragged clothing where they'd tripped and stumbled and been hauled to their feet again, and soldiers glued to them, and bakers and butchers and candlestick makers and children and pensioners and fat people and thin people and tall people and short people, lurching and staggering and stumbling, and she burst into laughter. She howled until the tears were streaming down her face to see such a ludicrous, ridiculous display. And the harder she laughed, the more people suddenly found that their hands, which had been attached to various parts of the anatomy of the person in front of them, came loose. And they gave praise to the princess for her magic of her laughter. They gave praise to the Tsar and Tsarina for being such sources of wisdom, even though they'd barely said a word except "what the bleeding hell is this," as the people staggered into the royal chamber. And before anyone could do anything, and they might end up re-glued, they'd legged it one by one, and even the poor old bishop stumbling and tripping with on his one bad leg from all of that hopping, and his one good leg that had previously been up at a very odd angle attached to a part of the chap in front of him's anatomy. They fled the chamber to recuperate their dignity, to wash their clothes, to soak their poor, sore, scarred up, scabbed up feet from all of that walking and trudging and hopping and staggering and stumbling. Until the last one left, as the tears were streaming down the princess's face, was Simpleton himself, with the goose under his arm, and his elderly friend, who said, I think we can let go of the goose now. And the goose flew away, once round the chamber, and then out of the chamber window, off disappearing into the great beyond. And the Tsar, who had made a grand declaration a year earlier, as to anyone who could make his poor benighted daughter laugh, had to admit that Simpleton and his goose had achieved just that. And of course the Tsar did not want to marry his daughter to some youngest half-witted son of a family of woodcutters, and so he ennobled Simpleton and gave him a new name and gave him lands along with his title, and so was able to arrange a wedding, a great feast of a wedding between his now lively daughter and the handsome if not terribly bright, but then he was royalty, so you can be as thick as a plank. It doesn't really matter if you're royalty. So long as you can make the crowds laugh. And the princess had rather fallen in love with Simpleton as the cause of all the joy in her life, because no matter what he did, she always ended up laughing. Somewhere along the line, and so they lived together, if not necessarily ecstatically, at least side-splittingly, for the rest of their lives.